It's spring, and the air is cool as Cleopatra sails away from Rome. Behind her, the Italian coastline fades into the mist. A few weeks ago, she was on top of the world. She had conquered the most powerful man alive, borne him a son, and walked the streets of Rome as his equal, perhaps even as his successor. And now, that's all gone. Julius Caesar is dead, his enemies have taken power. And Cleopatra, a foreign queen, a symbol of everything they hated about him, has no choice but to leave. She stands at the rail of her ship, staring toward the horizon. Her mind is racing. What now? She's reviewing the possibilities, making plans and backup plans. But there are no great options. Any way she looks at it, the work of the past 5 years has been completely undone. To say that her rule is precarious would perhaps be understating it. Her very life is at stake. But Cleopatra is, above all, a survivor. Within just a few years, she would rebuild her power, charm the most powerful man in Rome, and reclaim her place at the center of the world. But first, she had to survive.
I'm gonna show you how great I am.
This was our finest hour.
I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, I'd like to take this chance to apologize to absolutely nobody.
Hello, and welcome to How to Take Over the World. This is Ben Wilson, and this is part 2 on the life of Cleopatra. On episode 1, we saw how Cleopatra rose to power, won a civil war, and tried to establish a new dynasty with Julius Caesar before that hope was dashed by his assassination. On this episode, we will cover the rest of her life, including her relationship with Marc Antony, the Battle of Actium, her very famous death, her legacy, and more. As a reminder, this episode is based on the accounts of Cassius, Plutarch, as well as the excellent biography Cleopatra, A Life by Stacy Schiff. And if you would like to purchase that, you can use the link in the show notes and support the show while making that purchase. With all that said, let's dive in. This is part 2 on the life of Cleopatra. This episode is brought to you by Zcash. Encryption is necessary for an open society in the electronic age. If Cleopatra or Julius Caesar could see our age, they would be absolutely shocked by the lack of privacy. Encryption preserves your privacy and your anonymity and helps return to you the sense of freedom that past generations experienced. And Zcash is encrypted Bitcoin, digital cash that protects your agency and safety by encrypting your wealth. And that is something I really believe in. The idea that everyone, including governments and banks, would know what I'm doing whenever I make a purchase is just horrible to me. So consider Zcash. You can buy, store, and spend Zcash using the Zashi wallet. You can find it in the App Store or Google Play Store. So give it a try. Again, that is Zashi, Z-A-S-H-I wallet, and you can get it wherever you get your apps. This episode is brought to you by Gains in Bulk. Creatine is the only supplement I take every day. It improves muscle growth, recovery, and mental clarity. And Gains in Bulk makes the best creatine in the world. It's the only instantized creatine on the market. Instantized means that it has smaller creatine particles. And why is that important? Because it means that instantized creatine is more digestible, so you can get more benefit from every ounce with none of the bloating and chalkiness that you get from some other creatines. So try it out at gainsinbulk.com and use code BEN for 20% off your next order. Again, that is gainsinbulk.com and use code BEN. Now, the first issue for Cleopatra was the civil war going on in Rome. At the beginning, the lines of the civil war were actually not exactly clear. The Caesar faction is trying to make peace with the Liberty faction, sometimes called the Republican faction. There are divisions within each. People are switching sides. One good example of these shifting dynamics is the senator Dolabella. He was a close associate and friend of Caesar's. They had served together, and Caesar had tried to proclaim him consul at the very end of Caesar's life. It got a little complicated. Basically, he was never actually able to make Dolabella consul, but he was promised the consulship by Caesar. Okay. So he was assumed to be a pro-Caesar partisan when Caesar dies. However, he really wants to be consul, this consulship that he was promised. And so he makes peace with the Republican faction when they promise to uphold his appointment as consul. So he switches sides, but then one of the leaders of the Caesar faction, Marc Antony, offers him a governorship in Syria, and he switches sides again. You would think that in a political division defined by assassination, it would be impossible to overcome these differences. But, Rome is just built different. It's a sort of mob mentality. We've all lost someone here. I killed your boy, you killed mine. That's part of the game. And so people did switch sides quite frequently. Well, this matters to the story of Cleopatra because Dolabella requests some troops from Cleopatra, which she attempts to send to him, and which then gets intercepted by the Republican leader, Cassius. Okay? So naturally, she is trying to aid the pro-Caesar faction. If the Republicans or the Liberty faction get into power, she's in serious trouble, right? Because she has Caesar's son. She's very closely aligned with his legacy. But now the pro-Caesar faction doesn't know everything that has happened, and they want to know, wait, what's going on? Why does Cassius, one of our enemies, have 4 divisions of Egyptian warships? Okay, did Cleopatra flip on us? Why would she do that? And so Marc Antony, again, one of the leaders of the pro-Caesar faction, sends for answers from Cleopatra. However, his emissary is, surprise, surprise, incredibly charmed by Cleopatra and tells her, you should really come meet Marc Antony in person. I think that would be a good idea. So to back up, what's going on? Who is Marc Antony? It's now 3 years after the assassination of Julius Caesar, and Cleopatra has been cleaning up, expanding, consolidating her rule, taking care of a lot of the issues that were going on in Egypt, filling the coffers, making it profitable and wealthy again. And she's done a really good job. Okay, so Egypt is in good shape under Cleopatra. Back in Rome, the Caesarian camp has proven successful in the civil war, and the 2 top men of that faction, Octavian and Marc Antony, have split Roman territory between them. Octavian has taken the western territories, including Italy, Spain, and Gaul, and Antony has taken the eastern territories, including Greece, Asia, meaning Anatolia, modern Turkey, Syria, and Egypt. Octavian is Julius Caesar's grandnephew and the inheritor of his estate, and Marc Antony is one of Caesar's top lieutenants and the inheritor of his military legacy, because Octavian was not a commander at all. He wasn't a military man, and Marc Antony was. Antony is a really interesting guy. He's apparently very handsome, physically robust. He's like a swashbuckling cavalry commander. He's a bon vivant. He loves a good party. He's a hard drinker. He's a great womanizer. He's a real soldier's soldier. However, he's also very impressionable, fickle, and by some estimations, a subpar military commander. He had actually served in Egypt about a decade previously, and it's very possible, maybe even likely, that Cleopatra had in fact laid eyes on him. She would have been a young teenager, and he would have been a Roman commander at the time. He's already in adulthood. Maybe they even exchanged pleasantries. Maybe they had met. But at the very least, we can say she was intimately familiar with his character and reputation. So Cleopatra, she knows who this Marc Antony guy is, and technically she's not a Roman province, so she doesn't actually answer to him, but as a client queen of Rome, for all intents and purposes, she actually does. This is the guy in Rome who is now in charge of her. So she hatches an idea. She'll go to him, all right. He's just sent for her to explain, hey, we've kind of just won the civil war, and we've cleared out this Republican faction. We need you to answer for the fact that a bunch of your warships ended up on the opposite side, ended up fighting against us in the civil war. She says, all right, I'll come. I'll answer for this, but not on your terms. So this is what she does. Picture this scene. It's 41 BC in the city of Tarsus, which is now in southern Turkey. Marc Antony has set up his headquarters there, and he's lounging on his tribunal, hearing dispatches, deciding matters, sending out commands. And one of these commands is he has summoned Cleopatra to answer for her loyalties. But Cleopatra doesn't simply arrive. She stages an entrance for the ages. Marc Antony, at first, he doesn't see her barge. What he notices instead is the city emptying out before him. Like, he's in this kind of market center, city center square, and everyone's just leaving. Cleopatra was slowly making her way upstream from the Mediterranean to the city of Tarsus via the Cydnus River, which is this one river that goes right through the middle of Tarsus. And her barge is plated with gold. It has purple sails, which is, purple is an extremely expensive dye. It is the color of royalty, okay? So it's a gold boat with purple sails and silver oars that are rowed in unison to the music of flutes and lyres. She herself is lounging. She's dressed as Venus, okay? So she's got this appearance of a goddess. And she's attended by beautiful young boys dressed as cupids, fanning her on both sides. Her maidservants are costumed as graces, essentially like kind of like fairies. Think of them as fairies, all right? And they're working the ropes and the rudder, and the boat is trailing perfume. She's got tons of flowers and perfumes so that you can smell it before the boat even arrives. It's so overflowing with all these good smells and perfumes. And the people of Tarsus crowd the riverbanks. They're just enchanted. It's this huge spectacle. Word spreads that Venus has come to feast with Bacchus for the common good of Asia. Mark Antony has been portraying himself as a living embodiment of the god Bacchus, or Dionysus is maybe the more common known Greek form of that god. So he's the god of feasting and revelry. And so Cleopatra's entrance as Venus, it simultaneously upstages Mark Antony. He's left sitting alone in the marketplace as people flock to the river to see her entrance on this barge. But also at the same time, it makes her a perfect match for him. It's the perfect diplomatic message for the moment, right? It's both a promise and a threat. Like, hey, we're a match. I'm Venus, you're Dionysus. I will support you. We can get along great. We can totally send the same message together. However, at the same time, it also says, I can upstage you. I can make an even bigger splash than you, and I'm even more popular with the people than you are. And by the way, this moment of the people flocking and leaving Mark Antony alone in the market reminds me of something Peter Thiel wrote in 0 to 1. He says, clamor and frenzy are very real, but they rarely happen without calculated recruiting and pitching beneath the surface. And I think that this spectacle of this gilded barge with perfume and silver oars and cupids and goddesses and all this stuff, I'm sure it was enough to create a frenzy on its own. Even so, I doubt Cleopatra left anything to chance. She was a master of the art of spectacle, of pageantry. And that was one of the foundational acts of her reign, right? Is at the start, she had gone around Egypt and paid homage to the native gods, carrying out rituals and sacrifices in the Egyptian tongue as no Ptolemaic king or queen had done before her. And so I'm sure she knew that no good piece of theater is worth anything if it isn't seen. And I'm sure she had agents and spies and employees going out and telling people and encouraging them to go see this amazing sight that's going to be coming up the river, this amazing barge carrying a goddess. All right. So it's an amazing spectacle. Mark Antony is duly impressed and sends an invitation for her to come dine with him. And Cleopatra playfully rebuffs it. Instead, she insists he come to her. And this is definitely a power play because it is typically the more powerful party that hosts an initial meeting in Greco-Roman society. Antony is charmed. He's tickled by her boldness, and he complies and boards the queen's ship for an evening banquet. And the descriptions of this banquet are over the top, right? Torches and lanterns hang in perfumed groves of lights reflecting in the water. People talk a lot about all these lanterns and lights, and you can imagine, right? That's a very popular thing now, little twinkle lights, right? It really sets an ambiance. She's essentially doing this with lanterns. According to another account, in a subsequent dinner, she has roses like up to your knees. So it's unbelievably fragrant and beautiful. She has this like completely over the top feast set for Antony. And he is completely dazzled. He's overwhelmed. He attempts to host her the next night in Tarsus. But it's Roman. Romans are known for their republican simplicity, right? Their martial virtue. We don't get distracted by all this Greek extravagance, right? And so he tries to play it up, but he can't really. He's a Roman. That's not his forte. It is the forte of a Greek Ptolemaic queen, right? That is what they excel at. And so he kind of laughs at himself, joking about his rustic simplicity compared to her sophistication. And Cleopatra, to her credit, she is able to kind of change dynamics. So the first night she throws this big party, but at his party, again, that is less sophisticated, she kind of meets his coarse soldier's humor and wit and is able to joke with him about it and kind of speak his language, which charms him even more. Shakespeare would later write of this moment, "The barge she sat in like a burnished throne, burned on the water. The poop was beaten gold, purple the sails, and so perfumed that the winds were lovesick with them." All right. I love that. So this spectacle works. And by the end of their series of feasts and parties, Mark Antony is not only spellbound, but lovesick. And they're already lovers by the end of this brief meeting. This is another thing that all the greats understand, that there are levels of leadership. All right. And the first level is that of the mob boss, which is to say the leadership of a man, of one individual. Follow me because I'm powerful. And that does have a certain appeal, right? But there is a more powerful style of leadership, and that is the level of leadership of ideas, something that people can buy into and really believe in. And that's kind of the second level, is leadership of ideas, belief in something bigger than oneself. But there is a problem with that, which is that, we humans, we're still apes at heart, and we don't really follow ideas. We follow people. People follow other people. And so the highest level of leadership is the embodied idea. You inspire people with high-minded ideals, but you do that by completely embodying them yourself. You give people permission to follow those ideas by following you. Now, this is Napoleon saying, I am the revolution. All right. I am the revolution. I embody all the revolutionary ideas of enlightenment and rationality and equality. By following me, you follow the revolution. All right. This is Steve Jobs. He famously has that marketing campaign, here's to the crazy ones. But I think Steve Jobs really was the ultimate crazy one. He was building himself into the type of person who belonged on a Think Different poster. He was the embodied ideal of the Apple user. You want to be creative and interesting and intelligent and like Steve Jobs, right? She was Greek opulence and civilization. She was a goddess. She was Venus, right? And so all of that was wrapped into her and who she was. And so when you talk about her seducing Marc Antony, it's not like a physical carnal seduction. I mean, it's that as well. But again, as I said in episode 1, physical satisfaction was incredibly easy to come by for a Roman man, especially a Roman soldier. There were plenty of brothels and women who could be seduced or coerced or whatever, right? What was really, when we talk about the seduction of Cleopatra, it was the seduction of Alexandria, of this Eastern lifestyle, of being a god, right? That is really what she seduces Marc Antony with, because he certainly could have taken his physical satisfaction and left, and that was it, right? But that's not what happened. They become a couple, they fall in love, not just because Marc Antony was in love with her, although he was, and that's a big accomplishment in and of itself, but because he was in love with the idea that she embodied and what she represented. And by representing it, that is I think the ultimate diplomatic or strategic win of this part of Cleopatra's life. Now, there is also a strategic element to all of this, which is the same element that went into the relationship with Caesar, which is Egypt represents essentially unlimited amounts of money. That's really important to consolidating an Eastern empire and keeping yourself on a throne. And so that is also implicit in this love match / alliance. So Cleopatra's meeting with Marc Antony in Tarsus marks the second great alliance of her life. She's about 28 years old, in the prime of her intelligence and allure. Julius Caesar, her first Roman partner, had been dead for 3 years. Okay, so he's assassinated on the Ides of March in 44 BC. Marc Antony, for his part, we said he's a celebrated soldier. Maybe not a great strategist, but a great kind of man's man. The soldiers love him. He's famous for his bravery as well as for his partying. He's also, of course, one of the 3 men ruling the Roman Republic. We just talked about how he and Octavian kind of split the empire between them. There is actually a third guy at this point named Lepidus, but he's by far less powerful than the other 2, and he eventually gets crowded out and his territory taken over by Octavian. Antony has summoned Cleopatra ostensibly to investigate whether she supported, his enemy during the Civil War, that thing that we talked about with Dolabella and Cassius. And he expects deference from her because she is a client queen, right? She is reliant on Rome's goodwill to stay in power. Instead, he's met with this spectacle, and the dynamic immediately shifts in Cleopatra's favor, in part because she had so much to offer. She did have all this money. She had these relationships. She's an established monarch in the Eastern Mediterranean. Marc Antony's kind of a newcomer. But also, it just appears that Marc Antony, he vacillated. He was actually, he enjoyed fun. That was what motivated Marc Antony. He didn't really want to lead, and he wasn't a great leader. And so he really allows himself, in many ways, to be led by Cleopatra. This can be exaggerated sometimes. It's not like she led him around by the nose. No, he did have his own strategic considerations, and he had an opinion in all of this. But I mean, as you see the story progress, it does appear increasingly like Cleopatra is at least kind of co-ruler, if not really the one who's really making decisions, because Mark Antony is really not a proactive decision maker. That first winter of 41 to 40 BC, Antony and Cleopatra linger together, first in Tarsus, but then they go to Alexandria in Egypt, her capital. And there they cement their alliance with lavish indulgence. They form a private drinking society they call the Inimitable Livers, right? Not liver like in your body, but liver like living, right? Competing to throw each other the most extravagant feasts. By day, they go hunting or play dice. By night, they roam the streets of Alexandria in disguise, making mischief like carefree youth. You know, you can think of it like Alexandria is sort of, it's like half New York, half London of today. So you can imagine that they're basically like bar hopping by night. And the feeling that you get is that, you know, Antony always loved to party. I mean, that was like the defining attribute of who Mark Antony was. But with Cleopatra and this new kind of Eastern lifestyle, it's like he's young again, right? She's showing him that he can recover his youth and live this life that he just loves of partying and enjoyment and all the luxuries that Alexandria has to offer. Of course, the Romans portray it as him being ensnared by Eastern pleasures and forgetting his Roman virtue. During this period, Cleopatra asks Antony for the ultimate gift, the elimination of her last rival. Her younger sister, Arsinoe, she had rebelled against Cleopatra. She'd been defeated. Caesar marches her around in a triumph in Rome and then sends her to live in a temple where she is celibate and will have no future political prospects. However, there is always the fear for Cleopatra that some enemies of hers, some of the Greek aristocrats who really oppose her rule, could go fetch her out of this temple and say, look, we have a Ptolemy too, and we'll make her the queen. So the fact that she still lives is in some way a threat to her. And so she asks Antony to kill this sister of her. Antony, utterly enamored and eager to please her, has Arsinoe dragged from the temple and executed on the temple steps. This, on the one hand, is a big victory for Cleopatra, who has never been more stable and firm in her rule of Egypt. It's also a gross violation of religious norms, not just for the Greeks, not just for the Romans, but like for the entire Mediterranean world. And it's really, it's a scandal throughout the ancient world. But with that act, Cleopatra secures her throne beyond any internal opposition. She just no longer has to really worry at all about that front, and she now has one of Rome's most powerful men as her protector and her enforcer. She also secures something else, a new dynasty. In 40 BC, she gives birth to twins by Mark Antony, a boy, which she names Alexander Helios, and a girl, Cleopatra Selene. Okay, so that means Alexander the sun and Cleopatra the moon. Okay, this woman is not humble. She is not subtle. She has one child by Caesar, and she calls him Caesarion. She calls him Little Caesar. And then she has twins by Mark Antony, and she calls him Alexander Helio, Alexander the sun, basically saying like, this is the new Alexander the Great and Cleopatra the moon, right? Like to rival him in power. Unlike Julius Caesar, Antony openly acknowledges his children with Cleopatra, which is very bold, especially for a Roman. It suggests that Antony sees these half-Roman, half-Ptolemaic infants as potential heirs to an Eastern empire. He sees the same vision that Julius Caesar apparently saw. So Cleopatra now has not just one royal child, Caesarion, but three, entwining the Roman legacy even more with her own. The personal and the political blend together. Cleopatra and Antony style themselves as the new Dionysus and Isis, a divine couple destined to rule the East. Again, Julius Caesar never went this far in portraying himself as an Eastern god. He always, he tiptoed in that direction, you know, he made small gestures to see what was possible and what the Romans would go for, but he never really fully went that way. And Mark Antony is really just going for it. So for Cleopatra, you know, it's an unbelievable comeback. Just a few years earlier, she left the Roman payroll back at square one, but through Mark Antony, through seduction and statecraft, she has aligned herself with a new Roman champion who can fulfill all those same dreams that Caesar left unfinished. She is able essentially to run the same playbook back and get back into the same place of power. Now, despite the bliss of Alexandria, reality intrudes. Back in Italy, Antony's alliance with Octavian, again, that is Julius Caesar's grandnephew and adopted son, that alliance grows really strained. War almost erupts between Antony and Octavian, but things are repaired by a timely death. So Antony's wife, this whole time, he still has a Roman wife. Her name is Fulvia, and she is a really remarkable woman. She's really able to walk this line of Roman women are expected to just be virtuous, put their head down, support their husbands, but they are expected to have that Roman grit, right? And that iron backbone. And she's able to do both of those things, right? So she is able to seem like the dutiful wife while also being a legitimate political actor and working overtime to secure his rule. She's going around, she's pitching senators, going from province to province, drumming up troops, rallying support. And she does all this while he is out openly cavorting with this Eastern queen, and news every day is coming back to Rome of what he's doing. Nevertheless, Fulvia, she's like, well, my legacy and my survival is tied to this man, Marc Antony, no matter what. And so she's working overtime for his success. In fact, she works herself into an early grave and gets ill and dies. But this is actually more good news for Antony because her death allows for a peace settlement. Because to patch things up, Octavian offers his sister Octavia in marriage to Marc Antony in 40 BC. And Antony accepts. And for a time, he leaves Cleopatra, goes back to Italy. He marries the virtuous Octavia. And she was, by all accounts, kind of like Fulvia, a strong but thoroughly Roman woman who, like, no one could find fault with. She's young, she's beautiful, she's intelligent, she's a great conversationalist. She's everything you would want in a Roman wife. The only thing she doesn't give Antony is sons, right? She has children, but they're all daughters. And so for Antony, it's like, okay, well, this is a good peace settlement. It keeps me tied to Octavian. It keeps things stable. So he is living this life with Octavia, and his attention is being drawn back west. This episode is also brought to you by Founders. Founders is one of the only podcasts that I always listen to when it comes out. It's like How to Take Over the World, but for and about great founders of companies. The host, David Senra, has read hundreds of biographies at this point, and he is just so good at teasing out common lessons from the greatest to ever do it. He recently did an episode on how Elon Musk works, and it was just fantastic. If you are or aspire to be a founder, you have to check him out. So go check it out. That is Founders, wherever you get your podcasts. This could have been the end of their story. Antony might have stayed with Octavia and severed ties with Cleopatra for good. But two things happen. The one is that Cleopatra, I think she still holds on to Antony's imagination, if not his heart, probably both. He's a reveler, he's a partier at heart, and I think he still yearns for that lifestyle he had found with the inimitable livers out in Alexandria. The other thing that happens is he tries to invade the Parthian Empire, which is Persia, modern day Iran, and it goes horribly wrong. He's not a good commander. There's this whole fiasco with Armenia, who's supposed to support him, and they kind of betray him. They really don't back him up when they say they will. But he still feels like he needs their support, so he doesn't even punish them for betraying him. It's like, this is where you really get the idea, okay, maybe this Antony guy, he's known as Caesar's protege, but it really doesn't seem like he has any of Caesar's flair or firmness or decision-making, like any of his leadership qualities. And so he comes tail between his legs, running back to Syria, back to Roman territory after losing to the Parthians, and back into Cleopatra's arms, who says, look, I can support you some money, I can stabilize this whole situation. And so once again, kind of the strategic and the physical are linked together. And so he starts to distance himself from Octavia, and his center of attention turns back to the east, back to Egypt, back to Cleopatra. In 37 BC, Octavia is loyally attempting to send him troops and support. And she actually herself comes with these troops to Antony in the east, in Greece, and says, hey, come back to your wife, come back to Rome, accept these Roman troops, come be a Roman. And Antony pointedly refuses to even see her and sends her back to Rome, and instead reunites with Cleopatra in Antioch. Before long, the Roman triumvir has abandoned Octavia entirely, dishonoring her and infuriating Octavian, her brother. When Antony chooses Cleopatra over Octavia, his Roman wife, he wasn't just leaving a marriage, he was effectively choosing the East over the West, Alexandria over Rome, passion over duty. That last one, that's at least how Octavian would have played it up and made it seem, right? He's abandoning Roman virtue. He is choosing a luxurious Eastern lifestyle. And I think at this point, Antony thought that that was okay. He could get by with some Roman legions, supplemented with Greek troops and Asian troops and Egyptian money. Everyone knew that the Roman military was the greatest fighting force on earth, but perhaps Eastern riches could overwhelm it. Antony's defiance of Roman norms deepens as he and Cleopatra pursue their grand plans together. In 34 BC, after a military campaign, Antony and Cleopatra stage an elaborate ceremony in Alexandria known as the Donations of Alexandria. And this was the high watermark of their vision for a joint empire. And in hindsight, potentially their greatest political blunder. During a spectacular festival in the Alexandria Gymnasium, Antony sits on a golden throne dressed as Dionysus Osiris. Again, that's kind of the fusion of the Egyptian with the Greek god, alongside Cleopatra as Isis Aphrodite, once again, a fusion of the Egyptian and Greek goddess. Before a dazzled crowd, Antony declares Cleopatra Queen of Kings and Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, King of Kings, symbolically affirming the boy's status as Julius Caesar's true heir. He then distributes Eastern lands as royal fiefs to their children. Alexander Helios receives Armenia, Media, and even Parthia, which is a promise for future conquest, which has not happened yet. And Cleopatra Selene is granted Cyrenia and Libya. And then Cleopatra has also had now a third child by Marc Antony, Ptolemy Philadelphus, and he receives Syria and Cilicia. It's a breathtakingly bold declaration. It's essentially like saying we're trying to reestablish Alexander the Great's empire. That would have been clear by the context. The son named Alexander Helios, declaring that we're going to reconquer Parthia and integrate it. His queen is a Ptolemy, his friend of Alexander the Great's. Like, they are, with these donations of Alexandria, very clearly stating that we are going to reestablish a Greek, Roman, but really Greek empire in the Eastern Mediterranean modeled on Alexander's, with Alexandria as the center of this empire. To Cleopatra and the Alexandrians, this was a moment of glory, the dream of their glory days restored, and them at the center of the world. But to Octavian and many Romans, the donations of Alexandria were a total outrage. Like, what could be less Roman than this? We are a republic, we believe in equality. Antony was seen as giving away Roman territories to a foreign queen and her brood, right? Her children, and elevating Cleopatra as some sort of co-ruler of the Roman world. The propaganda almost wrote itself. Octavian seized on this oriental coronation to paint Antony as a traitor who was under Cleopatra's spell. And he was very careful to do this, right? Stacy Schiff notes the spectacle unequivocally incited Rome and its leader Octavian, confirming every fear that Antony aimed to erode the independence of Rome and shift its territories to a foreign ruler. And again, I said the propaganda almost wrote itself, but it was also in the hands of one of history's greatest propagandists in Octavian. And he knew how to stir up a scandal, right? So he starts calling Cleopatra the whore of the East. He claims, of course, that Antony is under her spell, that he's not really acting on his own volition. And he does one of the most infamous acts of all of history. He takes Antony's will and opens it and has it read, which was illegal, right? Wills were sacred, and they were supposed to be kept in a temple, not read by anyone. They were totally private until you died, and then they were opened by the priests in the temple and read to everyone, okay? So the fact that he opens Antony's will is completely outrageous and probably would have outraged the Romans, except for what was included in the will. And that was that he's going to be buried in Alexandria, not in Rome, next to Cleopatra, and he left huge inheritances to his children with Cleopatra. And this was illegal. You were not supposed to leave inheritances to children born of a foreigner. They were not legitimate and were not recognized. You only were supposed to leave inheritances to children with a Roman wife, right? Now, it is possible that Octavian fabricated this will. And that's one of those things that's just lost to history. We'll never know. But whether the will was legitimate or not, it jives with what just happened with the donations of Alexandria. And so everyone believes it, and it's a huge propaganda coup for Octavian. Roman pride was pricked. Would a Roman triumvir really give away Rome's conquest? You know, these territories that were won with Roman blood, right? Men died to incorporate these territories into Roman Imperium. And you're just going to give them away to some Greek, to some Alexandrian, some luxurious, opulent foreigner? It was totally outrageous to Roman citizens. And so Octavian, he goes into overdrive. He presents himself as the defender of Roman tradition, and Antony as a decadent fool, half traitor, half lovesick. Pamphlets and speeches depict Cleopatra as a sinister seductress aiming to conquer Rome from within. According to these attacks, Antony is no longer a true Roman, not even in his right senses. He is an emasculated consort of an Eastern queen, now even calling himself the new Dionysus. And again, like, he's just playing into this because he is calling himself the new Dionysus. And it says that he's neglecting his duties in Rome. Well, he hasn't been seen in Rome now for years. So by 32 BC, Octavian secures a declaration of war. And this is the important part. Not against Antony, because he wants to avoid another civil war. People are so tired of civil wars by this point. There's the civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey, and then there's the civil war between Octavian and Antony on one side versus the Republicans on the other side. Actually, going back, there are the civil wars with Sulla. Like, Rome has been in a state of civil war for a long time. And a big part of Octavian's rule rests on the fact that he is going to pacify Rome. No more of these civil wars. I'm going to end it. Everyone can unite under me and the system that I am implementing. So he wants to get away from saying that this is another civil war. So he declares war not on Antony. You get the idea that Octavian is trying to say, poor Antony, hey, maybe we can even save him. Maybe we can get him out of the clutches of this foreign temptress. And so Octavian declares war against Cleopatra. Antony, bound by love and honor, of course, sides with Cleopatra. I mean, it's not real. I mean, to be clear, Octavian is saying all this. He is really declaring war, though, on Antony, who is the one who is ultimately in charge. And thus began the final civil war of the Roman Republic. Now, it's interesting. Cleopatra is a master of spectacle and propaganda. How could she at least not suspect the effect of all this? The donations of Alexandria, the, Dionysus and Isis, the god and goddess. Like, how could she have not known the effect all this would have had back in Rome? It's impossible to know what she was thinking. But I think the answer is that she did know that this would happen, at least on some level. Maybe she wasn't aware exactly just how shrewd and effective Octavian was as a propagandist and an opinion manipulator. But she knew the basic line of attack. But I really think that Cleopatra and Antony, the two of them really believed it just didn't matter anymore. I think they really believed that they had enough power in the East that they could withstand any attacks from Octavian and Rome. And I think that Octavian was the master of the slow victory, right? And so he is slowly consolidating power in Rome. And so it reaches a point where I think Antony and Cleopatra think, okay, it's really not possible to recover the Roman front, to get the majority of the Senate on our side, the majority of the senators, the majority of public opinion. In fact, our only option now at this point is to establish a center of power in the East. And so, why do they do this? Even though they know that it's going to be so unpopular back in Rome, I think they think that they're out of options and they have to establish really an Eastern empire that is really not Roman in many ways because the Roman option is gone to them by the clever maneuvering of Octavian. Whatever they were thinking, civil war does break out with Octavian declaring war on Cleopatra. There's skirmishing and maneuvering. Antony and Cleopatra move their main force to the western coast of Greece. If you'd like to know more about what happens there, you can listen to my Caesar Augustus episode. But the key to know here is that Octavian's brilliant general Agrippa was able to use speed to deny Antony resupply bases and pin his army down in Greece. Antony's camp was a strange sight. A Roman war council, including many senators, okay? Certainly the Roman Republic was not completely unanimous in their support of Octavian. And so many Roman senators do show up to support him. So it's a Roman war council, but it includes an Egyptian Ptolemaic queen in it as one of the key decision makers. Ancient sources, and all our ancient sources are Roman, okay? So keep that in mind. So the ancient sources sneer that Cleopatra influenced Antony's strategic decisions, notably the decision to fight at sea rather than on land. Antony had superior numbers on land, but Cleopatra's fleet was formidable, and perhaps she favored a naval plan that could secure a line of retreat to Egypt if needed. Maybe she just wanted her own ships in the fray, fighting the battles, so that she seemed more important. But really, Antony himself said that he thought they had an advantage at sea with all their ships. They did have a bigger navy as well. The big disadvantage is that the Octavian navy is led by Agrippa. And Agrippa is just like exceptional military commander, especially at sea. He's like unbeatable. Stacy Schiff, the biographer, argues that Antony and Cleopatra were not seeking an outright naval victory at Actium at all. They were attempting a breakout. Antony's goal, Schiff suggests, was to breach Octavian's blockade, escape with their treasury and fleets intact, and regroup to fight another day back in the Eastern Mediterranean, probably in Egypt. In other words, Actium might have been less a decisive battle than a high-stakes escape plan gone awry. In this telling, Antony and Cleopatra recognize that they are defeated before the battle even begins. Agrippa and Octavian have cornered them. Victory is impossible, so, our only option is escape. What does happen? The battle itself is on September 2nd, 31 BC, and was by all accounts confusing and hard fought. So Antony and Cleopatra had perhaps 500 ships, many of them large war galleys, against Octavian's lighter but better maneuvered fleet of 250 under Agrippa's command. They fought from late morning until afternoon, neither side gaining a clear advantage at first. And then comes this very famous and fateful moment. It's been retold in 100 dramas. But Cleopatra's contingent of ships suddenly raise sail and break from the battle, heading for the open sea. And Antony immediately left the fight and followed her, abandoning the rest of his fleet, which continued to fight on in confusion. To the Romans who later heard of it, Antony's desertion was the ultimate proof that he was bewitched. He threw away victory for Cleopatra's sake, they thought. Even Plutarch, generally sympathetic to Antony, he says he was compelled to follow her when he saw her ship underway. It has forever painted Cleopatra with an image of cowardice or treachery at Actium. And maybe that is what happened. Or maybe it's possible what Schiff thinks, that Cleopatra's withdrawal was pre-planned once the breakout corridor was open. Her fleet had been loaded with the Egyptian treasure, essentially their lifeline for continuing the war. And they had essentially made the bet that Eastern treasures could substitute for Roman armies, right? And so if they stayed and lost a pitched battle, everything would have been lost. If they escaped, they could fight again on more favorable terms. Schiff points out that Cleopatra timed her departure with the wind and the moment of opportunity. It was a calculated gamble to save the core of their power. Antony's mistake was not necessarily fleeing with her, that may have been part of the plan, but perhaps in failing to adequately inform or coordinate the rest of the fleet and the army. And if that was the case, it was a truly disastrous failure of communication. The commanders left behind, not understanding the intent, fought on for a while, but they're like, wait, Antony and Cleopatra are gone? What's going on? And so they fought on for a while. It was a hard-fought battle, but eventually they surrender. And Antony's loyal soldiers, feeling abandoned, defect to Octavian en masse in the aftermath. And so what might have been a strategic retreat turns into a complete rout. And in the end, Actium was a catastrophe for Antony and Cleopatra, but not in the simplistic way of Octavian's propaganda, perhaps. But regardless, the outcome is the same. They escape with their lives and their treasure, but essentially at the cost of losing the war in a single stroke. If they thought that they could regroup in Alexandria and use this treasure to reconstitute a new army, they were kidding themselves. And as they sail away, I think Antony realizes what has happened because the accounts say that he was completely despondent, reportedly sitting alone on the prow of his ship for 3 days, refusing to speak. The couple had survived to fight another day, barely, but most of their allies see this and think, all right, this is not the winning side. And one by one, the client kings and Roman legions that had stood with them went over to Octavian. Octavian, ever the master of spin, didn't even trumpet a grand victory. He let it be known that Antony and Cleopatra had run away. Not exactly a heroic last stand, not something that you're going to be attracted to. Oh, we lost the battle, but maybe we can win another. It's like, no, these guys turned tail and ran. And so everyone's like, oh, that's not who I want to stand and potentially die with, right? So there is this ambiguity that still lingers over the Battle of Actium. I think the ambiguity itself speaks to the lack of leadership from Antony. Win or lose, there was never any ambiguity about what Julius Caesar was trying to achieve in any given battle. The same could be said of Alexander the Great or Napoleon or any great military leader. The very fact that Antony's aims were debated, even then, speaks to his lack of leadership. And could Cleopatra be partially to blame for that? Is it possible that she tried to assert her authority and her strategic thinking, and this led to confusion in terms of who was really in charge and what was really the battle plan before Actium? Maybe. I mean, it's certainly possible. But remember, she had already fought one hard war side by side with Julius Caesar. And at that time, she had not overstepped her bounds, even though it was fought on her home turf and in part with her troops, troops loyal to her. So if she stepped in with Antony at Actium, I don't think it's because she was just some meddling woman, as Octavian liked to portray it, but rather because Antony was such a weak leader that there was a real vacuum of leadership, and Cleopatra saw that someone needed to step up, and she tried to provide that gap in leadership. The fact that such an effort was in fact doomed is not necessarily an indictment on her. It very well could have been the best chance that they had. Whatever the cause of failure though, Actium was a disaster that spelled the beginning of the end. Octavian did not delay in pressing his advantage. In 30 BC, he invaded Egypt itself. Antony musters a last defense. He does, in fact, win a small skirmish outside of Alexandria on August 1st, 30 BC, defeating Octavian's cavalry in a burst of his old brilliance. But the victory was ultimately meaningless. The same day, Antony's fleet surrendered, which is really the core of the matter. And so seeing this, that people are defecting, that no one's actually going to stay and try and defend him, Antony decides to go out in one last glorious cavalry charge, a heroic death befitting a heroic life. But his cavalry defect to Octavian, and this heroic charge turns into a farce, right? Like all the men go over to Octavian's side, and now it's just Antony and like his little retinue of a few personal servants and followers. With nowhere left to turn, Antony returned to the city only to find that Cleopatra had locked herself in her mausoleum, a secure fortress-like tomb she had built for this very scenario. Okay, so Antony is caught in this no man's land of Octavian's not even attacking him. All his forces have gone over to Octavian, so he's alone. He tries to go back to his city to try and hole up there with Cleopatra. She's not there. She's holed up in her mausoleum. What she's essentially doing is she's taking herself hostage. She's got all her treasure with her in this mausoleum, and she's saying that she is going to commit suicide and light all this treasure and all these goods on fire if Octavian tries to get her. And she spreads a rumor to Antony that she is already dead. She has committed suicide. And what she's trying to do is encourage Antony to himself commit suicide. So he hears this, that she's dead, and this is the final blow to his spirit. Everything is lost now, right? His army is lost, his honor, his kingdom, the woman for whom he gave it all up. In despair, Antony chooses the one path that's left to him. The thing that, Octavian doesn't want to come take him either. Everyone's kind of going, all right, Antony, like, the right thing to do. Everyone's essentially waiting for him to commit suicide. And so he says, okay. According to Plutarch, Antony calls his servant Eros to help him do the deed. And Eros, devoted to the end, Antony was not the greatest leader, but he was personally exceptionally charismatic. And the people around him really did love him. And so Eros just can't bring himself to kill his master, and instead turns the sword on himself and commits suicide and falls dead at Antony's feet. Antony, moved by his loyalty, cries, "So it is not easy, Eros, to do what you bade me do." And then he stabs himself with his sword. But he doesn't manage the suicide right. Antony is incompetent to the very end. And so he wounds himself in the abdomen, but he doesn't die. And he's just slowly bleeding out. So blood-soaked and racked with pain, Antony is just kind of lying there waiting to die very slowly when word comes that Cleopatra is still alive, hiding in this mausoleum. Upon hearing she was alive, Antony begs to be brought to her. And so he is. Antony, fatally wounded, was carried by his remaining loyal soldiers to the base of Cleopatra's mausoleum. The doors were barred. Cleopatra feared a trick by Octavian, and she would not open them. So the only access was a high window. In a scene as tragic as it is cinematic, Cleopatra and her two maidservants hoisted Antony up to the side of the tomb with ropes. Cleopatra straining with all her might, and then Antony is lowered in. He's smeared with blood and struggling against overwhelming pain, and he's drawn into the mausoleum and into Cleopatra's arms. And here in this somber chamber, this house of death, amid burning incense and treasures piled around them, Marc Antony dies in Cleopatra's arms. Plutarch paints the moment poignantly. Cleopatra laid him down and tore at her robes in grief, covering his wounds and calling him her lord, her emperor, her soldier. Antony, with his last breaths, urged her not to mourn, but to save herself, to trust Octavian's honor, and secure mercy for her children. In Shakespeare's dramatization, Antony's final words to her are, "I am dying, Egypt dying, a Roman by a Roman valiantly vanquished," accepting that he had been conquered by Octavian and begging Cleopatra not to linger in sorrow. So Antony dies as a Roman by his own hand, but in the arms of the Egyptian queen he loved. Cleopatra, now alone, presses his blood-stained face to hers. According to Shakespeare, cribbing Plutarch, she utters a brilliant, bitter lament. There is nothing left remarkable beneath the visiting moon. So Octavian, with this, enters Alexandria, and he's got this weird situation where he wants to make sure that Cleopatra does not, light this great treasure on fire. And so he keeps telling her, no, it's okay. I really want to keep you as queen. We can really work things out. She knows this is not true. She's trying to secure concessions, stuff in hard writing, getting him to do stuff that he's not willing to do. And eventually he kind of extracts her from this mausoleum in like a special operations operation where soldiers kind of climb in through this top story window and grab Cleopatra before she can commit suicide and light all of her treasure on fire. According to some sources, when Octavian and Cleopatra finally meet for the first time face to face, she tries to play all of her same old tricks and tries to seduce him as she had seduced Antony and Caesar. And the same allure. Hey, Octavian, you're really a monarch now. Don't you want to rule as a god king, as a fusion of Caesar and Alexander for a new world that you're going to create? But Octavian is a different breed, young, cold-eyed, immune to her charisma. It's also helpful that, with his victory over Antony, there's no one to challenge him. He doesn't need Egypt anymore. He can have everything that Cleopatra is promising him without Cleopatra. Like, he doesn't need her. He's won everything. And so he meets her pleas with stony silence. Finally, Cleopatra drops all pretense and says, "I will not be led in a triumph." Octavian, in his polished way, spares her life, saying he will keep her alive, but pointedly offers no details of his plans. So, he fully intends to take her to Rome, regardless of her feelings, and march her around in a triumph. And then, in all likelihood, probably not kill her, but she's probably going to live out her days in a Roman prison, which is not a much better way to go. But Octavian is not just cold and unfeeling in every single way. He does allow Cleopatra to embalm and entomb Antony's body with honors. She visits his tomb and weeps, calling him husband, saying goodbye in a heart-wrenching final monologue recorded by Plutarch. Quote, "Nothing could part us in life, but now in death perhaps we shall be separated. I, captive and conquered, shall be buried in Italy, while you rest here in Egypt. But if there is any power in the gods, they will not allow me to be led in triumph over you. Bury me with you, Antony, as this last sorrow is beyond what I can bear." Okay, so in these last words, Cleopatra makes clear her resolve. She doesn't want to be separated from Antony. She doesn't want to be humiliated. She does not want to be taken to Rome. Now, Octavian has her on close watch so that she can't commit suicide. But she is under house arrest. She is still living as a queen, and she still got these servants with her. One day, someone brings in a basket of figs, and the Roman soldiers guarding it take a look at it. Yeah, it's figs, and they deliver it to her. As these figs are delivered, she says, "I have a letter for Octavian. Will you please take it to him?" And they say, "Okay." These figs, however, mask something. We don't know what. According to the ancient sources, it is a venomous snake, perhaps an asp or a venomous Egyptian cobra. I find it unlikely that the Roman soldiers would not notice a giant cobra beneath these figs. I find that hard to believe. I think it more likely that it was simply poison that was smuggled in. Cleopatra sends away all of her servants except for her two most loyal women, and then finishes her meal. She has this last letter delivered to Octavian. Octavian reads the letter, and in it reads Cleopatra's words that, "You can't have me, I'm already dead." And he sends his guards running. "Stop her, go break in immediately, find out what's going on. Do not let Cleopatra die." And when they burst in, they find Cleopatra lying lifeless on a golden couch, arrayed in her royal robes. Her maid Iris was already dead at her feet, and Charmian, the last loyal servant, was feebly adjusting the crown on Cleopatra's brow so that she would look beautiful even in death. One of the Roman guards shouted furiously at Charmian, "What a fine deed this is!" Essentially saying like, "Oh, how could you have done this? What a fine deed this is. You killed the queen. We wanted to let her live, and you're denying us the opportunity to march her in a triumph back in Rome." And with her last breath, Charmian replies, "It is indeed fine and befitting the descendant of so many kings." And then she too falls down dead beside her beloved queen. Oh, what a scene. What a scene. How much of it is dramatized, we'll never know. But Cleopatra was a master of drama. And so I think it's too good not to believe, right? That her servant really does say, "It is indeed fine and befitting the descendant of so many kings," and then falls down dead after adjusting the tiara on Cleopatra's head. I choose to believe it. What an amazing scene from history. And I think speaks to the resilience of Cleopatra's character, right? Where Antony kind of botches his death and she is able to kind of recover it and make it dramatic in this last scene of holding him as he dies and weeping face to face with him. But her suicide is perfect and beautiful and poetic. Do I think it was actually a snake? No, I do not. For a number of reasons. One, it's just hard to smuggle in a snake under these figs. For another, it's doubtful whether a snake would have enough venom to kill 3 women in succession. And just trusting to a snake to be the cause of suicide is like trusting a lot on a wild animal, right? Bite me, now bite this other woman, now bite this other woman. So I think it was probably just poison. But the snake has this resonance because the snake is symbolic of Egypt. And I think it's possible that it was snake's venom and Cleopatra herself was instrumental in stirring up this rumor that it was in fact a snake who bit them and caused them to die. Now, what happens to her progeny? She sends Caesarion away to India. There were little Greek communities in India, and she wants him beyond the reach of Octavian. And so Caesarion has this tutor who's supposed to help take him there and get him settled. And the tutor, unfortunately, is not faithful and says to Caesarion, I think he's looking at this life in a foreign land, in a small Greek community, and he's saying, this is not really how I want to live. And so he says to Caesarion, hey, actually, I'll bet you that your cousin Octavian is willing to be forgiving, which is not true. So they turn around and Octavian has him quietly executed. So regrettably, Caesarion dies. However, Antony doesn't have the same political legacy. And so his children are allowed to live normal lives back in Rome, and Octavian allows them to be raised royally. And we kind of lose track of them. We don't know what happens. Presumably they are upstanding Roman citizens who don't make much of a name for themselves, but don't get out of line and have children of their own. And that line continues. And Cleopatra has children who survive her, but they all are Roman. And so she has descendants who are Roman. The person actually who raises them is, of all people, Octavia, Antony's wife, who he had divorced in order to to shack up with Cleopatra. So with Cleopatra's death in August of 30 BC, the Ptolemaic dynasty comes to an end, and Egypt becomes a province of Rome. Octavian returns to Rome as master of the world, soon to be granted the title of Augustus, the first Roman emperor. The myth of Cleopatra only grows. In the minds of people across the empire, she became at once the beautiful, scandalous lover of great men and the brilliant, charismatic queen who dared to challenge Roman power. As one later writer noted, age could not wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety. She had immortal longings, a phrase Shakespeare lends to her on the verge of her death, a desire to go out on her own terms and join her lover in eternity. So what do we find in the legacy of Cleopatra? What can we learn for ourselves? On the one hand, I think we find a shrewd strategist and leader. We find someone who was able to solidify and expand Ptolemaic rule in Egypt before losing it all. And someone who came very, very close to cementing her family as the rulers of the entire world and permanently intertwining herself with Julius Caesar as the preeminent family in the Mediterranean world and in Rome. All of her siblings and most of her forebears died violent deaths. Only Cleopatra can say that she went out on her own terms. Okay, so what are my takeaways? Number one is the power of pageantry, right? That is how she comes to power. That is how she cements her popularity amongst the Egyptian populace. That is how she is able to seduce Julius Caesar and Marc Antony and seduce the sort of whole Eastern Mediterranean world to believe in her rule. Then the next takeaway is, building on that point, is the necessity of working behind the scenes to build a fever pitch, right? As Peter Thiel says, yes, it is possible to create mania, but often there's a lot of work behind the scenes that you don't see that makes that happen. And then my third takeaway is sort of a negative one, which is never overestimate money. I think sometimes you just think that you can buy anything with money, that money is a substitute for actual power or military capabilities or any capabilities in any domain, and that you can just buy your way out of any problem. And I think that Cleopatra and Marc Antony got seduced by this idea that Egypt was so wealthy and their eastern provinces so wealthy that they could just buy their way out of this problem, this conflict with Octavian, and in the end, she couldn't. And then my final takeaway is what we talked about earlier of the power of the embodied ideal. Cleopatra was able to achieve what she did, to reach the very top, if even for just a brief, fleeting moment, by embodying Venus or Isis in Egyptian ceremonies, by standing for something bigger than herself, but taking those larger ideas and values and making them a part of her personal charm and appeal. And so I think that concept of the embodied ideal is something that Cleopatra did well and that every great leader has to do well. All right, I found Cleopatra to be a really remarkable woman. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Next week, we'll be coming with episodes on the great American industrialist and robber baron Andrew Carnegie. Until then, thank you for listening to How to Take Over the World. This episode was also brought to you by Speechify. I use Speechify for this episode to do my reading and research. Speechify turns anything into a podcast. I find that when I read and listen at the same time, I both get through material faster and have higher retention. So if you are someone who wants to learn more and learn faster, then Speechify is for you. Give it a try at speechify.com and use code BEN for 15% off Speechify Premium. Again, that is speechify.com.